Very true. Yeah. Thank you. I'll just up there. Hi. It is nice to see you all. I've read some of your bios, and so I'm somewhat intimidated, but let's do this. Okay, so I was told that you wanted that I should start out and give you all some background about who I am. So this is where I'm from. This is a part of the Bronx called Co-op City. Has anyone ever been? Anybody? Somebody? One person? Two people? Okay. That's what it looked like when I was growing up. That's me as a little kid. That's me as a teenager, you know. I then went to Bennington College. So in my bio it says I got a public school education. I feel like those of us that believe in public education have to say that we believe in public education. So I believe in public education, and I got a really good one. I then went to Bennington College. Has anyone ever been to Bennington, heard of Bennington? No? Like two people again? Okay. So Bennington is in Vermont. It's like really middle of nowhere. They gave me really good financial aid. This is the important part, right? So they gave me really good financial aid. So I went to Bennington. I was like undecided. I didn't know what I was going to study. It was going to be arts related, vaguely, right? I wasn't really sure. While I was at Bennington, I wound up, one winter I was in New York, I was back home, and I was doing an internship with an arts organization, and they were doing some work on Rikers Island. So is anyone familiar with Rikers? I'll talk about it a little more later. Ah, finally, a place everybody knows. Sadly, right? Has anyone been there? Visited? Been there? Okay, all right, cool. So I met some artists, some teaching artists, and they were going to go to Rikers, male artists, and they were going to facilitate poetry workshops for boys. And so I was like, oh, that makes sense to me. So I grew up in the Bronx in the 90s, in like the 80s, 90s. I'm 40, like whatever, you know. So the top picture is probably in the 70s, right? And then, so I grew up during a time that people get very nostalgic about. The hip hop was better, it's true. But it was also a time when there was certainly more crime in the city, and we were like overly incarcerating people, kind of irregardless of the fact that there was more crime. So I had heard about Rikers really only through the experience of people who had been there, and like my friends or neighbors and folks who had been there. So I was curious when I met these artists who were going to teach there. Like, it made sense to me. And I said, can I go with you? And they said, you look like a little girl, you can't come with us. And so I was like, F you, I'll start a program for the girls, because they were going to go work with boys. So at the time, so this is like the mid-late 90s, so like there was an internet, but there wasn't anything on it. So I couldn't find any information whatsoever. So I had to go the old school route. I wrote a lot of letters, and I found out there were girls on Rikers, and there was a school for girls on Rikers, and I found the principal's information, and I started reaching out to her. I basically stalked this woman by mail, you know, and she just kept turning me down. She was like, you know, like, why do you want to come? You don't want to come here. Why do you want to come here? What do you want to do? You know, and I'm like, how old am I then? Probably like 21 or whatever. And I'm like, no, really, I've thought this through. Like, I really want to come there. And in the meantime, I'm in Bennington thinking, I don't know how to facilitate a poetry workshop. I just think this is a good idea. So I start doing like some student teaching at a local high school. I go to this local high school that has no relationship with the college, right? So it's like just a local high school in this town. And I said, I would like to work with the kids that you have in special ed. And they didn't have a relationship with the college. So they're like, no, we'll give you our honor students. And I'm like, how is that? I don't want your honor students. I was like, I want your kids. I want the kids who aren't going to get it otherwise, right? So I'm working with kids up there in like, I'm talking about like middle of nowhere, like, okay, you with me? Like there's, like the stores close at like 5 o'clock or something. It's not, this is not the New York, right? So, and I'm practicing how to teach poetry. Like, what does it mean to teach poetry? And I'm getting more excited about going to Rikers, but I can't get anybody to give me permission to go there, right? So finally the principal's like, just, you know, people don't know where Vermont is, right? This is like a thing in America. We don't have any sense of geography, right? It's the truth. So the one day, like I call the principal, because this is my way. I call her and I write her letters, and she's just like, all right, fine. Just come, I'll meet with you next week. And I'm like, well, damn, like I have classes. I'm in Vermont, I'm in another state. Okay, but I'm like, all right, I'll be there. So I go to Rikers and she stood me up. I love this woman. Okay, let me just say this, right? But now I do. But I went, she stood me up, and there was an assistant principal, and she took pity on me. And she was just like, what do you want to do? And I'm like, I have a break from college, and I'm going to be I'm going to be home for, I have 4 weeks, and I want to come in, I want to facilitate a poetry, I want to bring poets with me and do a performance and then facilitate a poetry workshop. This is my whole plan. And she's like, okay, whatever, fine. So she cleared me to do it. And I'm like, okay. So I went, and it was probably on the second or third day, the principal was waiting for me outside of the room that I was facilitating a workshop in, and she said, have you ever thought about being a teacher? And I had, I had thought about being a teacher, but I had no plan. I was getting ready to graduate college, I had no plan. And so I was like, well, yes, I've thought about it. And she said, I would like you to be a teacher here. And I'm like, well, I haven't graduated yet, and I have to graduate, And she said, all right, we'll graduate, and then, the next day, come, I want you to teach here. So I graduated, and I literally turned 22 on Rikers Island. It was my 22nd birthday. So Rikers, I'm gonna talk for a second. In a second, I'm gonna talk about the justice system. Let me fast forward and do that. How familiar are people with America? This is very simplified, and it's crazy complicated. How about that? So how familiar are people with the justice system here? How familiar do you feel? A little bit? Okay. It's like, do you watch Law and Order? That's kind of the question, right? Okay. That's not really, look, unfortunately, Law and Order is full of inaccuracies. Yeah. And it breaks my heart. And one of the co-executive producers used to be a legal aid lawyer. I don't even get it. Okay. So someone gets arrested in the United States, and a lot of it depends on how old they are. So in New York State, right now, this second, if you're under 16, the law is different for you. The age of criminal responsibility in New York right this second is 16. Now, next year, it's going to go up to 18, but only for nonviolent offenses. That's in the weeds. I'm not going to go there. But if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it later. But so there's 3 basic things that can happen when someone gets arrested. They could have the charges dropped. And let's be honest, who gets charges dropped? White people. Okay. Well, and white people, children of police officers, you know what I mean? But so the charges could be dropped, you could be released, that's the end of it, nothing else ever happens. Someone can get probation. Probation, people know what probation is? Yeah. What do you think probation is? Does anyone have a sense of what you think probation is?
You pay money?
Huh. You might have to pay fees as probation, but that's bail. So probation is where they watch you. It's basically you're being surveilled. I mean, not exactly, but so you have to report for probation. So probation is sort of what people often call a backdoor to the system. So at the very beginning, they're like, no, you can go, but we're going to watch you for 5 years. So you might not do anything else in 5 years, or you might do something else. There's a lot of things are crimes, do you know what I mean? Who knows? But so probation's kind of a backdoor. But in that moment, this is green because it means you're physically free. So in that moment, you might get probation. Or not in that moment, you go to court, you get probation. Or you could be detained. So it's called detention if you're an adult or if you're a young person, right? But they're different places. So if you're an adult, you go into the criminal court system. And so that's what you see in Law and Order. There's a judge, you might get a trial. Very few people get trials. The vast majority of people are forced to take plea bargains. And which is very complicated and has all kinds of immigration implications and all kinds of other implications. So again, that's in the weeds, but if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it later. So this is Law and Order. That's where you see the gavel. There's gavels involved. So young people have an entirely different system. And the reason I thought I should explain this is because I saw in some of the bios that some of you are not from the United States. And our system is we went out of our way in the United States to make a stupid, complicated system, right? And a system that is unjust on every front. So young people who are so I'll talk about juvenile justice system in a second, but young people basically are tried in family court usually. And so first family court was opened around the turn of the century, it was either 1899 or 1901, I forget, I'm pregnant, we'll just chalk it up to that. But so that was the first family court was in Chicago. I think we might have had the second one. But so the idea of family court's where foster care cases are tried. Family court is where issues around abuse and neglect, et cetera, right? but they're also where juvenile justice cases are tried. And there's no trial there. You don't get a trial. And you don't get, so there's no trial above your peers. And there's various ways that you can wind up in the juvenile justice system, and they don't all necessitate having committed a crime. So we'll talk about that in a second, but so young people wind up, this is their equivalent essentially of being in court, right? It is a courtroom, but it does not look like Law and Order. So at that point, a few different things can happen, right? So this is like basically the resolution of a case. So that's where the gavel is. That's where someone slams a gavel. They have gavels here. I haven't heard them slammed, but they have gavels. So on the adult side, a few things can happen, right? You could get released, like good money. Go ahead, go get released. You could get probation. Again, they're going to watch you, probation's a city thing. Or you could be incarcerated in a city or county jail. So Rikers is our city or county jail. So if you're an adult, Rikers is detention. You get held there. Someone said bail before. That's because in New York State, we have cash bail. So you can get arrested and they can say, we don't know if at this point, we don't know if you're innocent or guilty, right? In the United States, you're presumed innocent until proven guilty. So, but what we say in New York is, we don't know if you're guilty or not. We're going to assume you're innocent. But if you want to get out of here, you got to pay 10% of your bail. So if your bail is $200,000, you got to pay $2,000. So really, it's a test of social networks. Do you know somebody who will come and pay bail for you? Right? That's really what the question is. So someone can also be incarcerated on Rikers. They call it a city year here. It's 8 months. I don't know why. Other states, other county, city, most places, jails are run by counties. In New York, we have 5 counties in a city, so ours is city, right? So you could be incarcerated there, and then eventually you would get released, and you might even be released on probation. They just like to watch people. You could wind up incarcerated in state or federal prison, in which case you'd be released. In the state, you might have parole, where they want to watch you. In the federal government, they have probation, where they want to watch you. America likes to watch you. Okay? On the juvenile justice side, you could wind up released. You could wind up on probation. Or you could wind up in what we call placement. Some places call it youth prisons. California calls them juvenile. They have juvenile camp. They have youth camps or juvenile camps, something like that. So different states all call things different things. And then a young person can then be released. They could just be released, or they could be released on aftercare because America likes to watch you, okay? So Rikers is New York City's county jail. So it's detention, and it's and people can be incarcerated there, but only for a short period of time. If it's going to be more than 8 months, then they send you upstate. So, so I wind up working on Rikers. I developed this odd affinity for Rikers. It's a place that, captured my heart in a weird way. And I was working at the Rose M. Singer Center, that building on the bottom, ugly, ugly building. But the people there have a lot to say and a lot to write about. And so I started out as a classroom teacher, and I realized really quickly that I wasn't meant to work there full time. It's a really intense place to work, and I wasn't meant to be there full time. And I knew that I needed context, and there was nothing on the internet, right? I remember this. So I needed context, and I didn't have any. And so I felt like all I knew about where I was learning by being there, and I knew that it wasn't healthy, or it wasn't giving, so I knew I needed to do work outside. So I resigned my position, and then but I kept my substituting license. So then like every teacher in the school that needed to go have surgery and stuff, everybody was out for months, whatever. Anyway, so I kept teaching there. But I asked the principal if I could come back once a week to teach a workshop, to facilitate a poetry workshop. And she did not care, because she was paying me as a full-time teacher. So she was like, yeah, you want to come for free? Come for free. Mm-hmm. So I kept coming back for 10 years. I taught a workshop there for free. I have this image of solitary confinement there. That's the old solitary confinement. People used to call it the Bing. I put that there because when I first started teaching on Rikers, there had just been a lawsuit. It's a Hansberry lawsuit. And it had to do with education for young people who had special ed needs on Rikers, and who were in solitary confinement. And so this lawsuit had been, a judge had basically said, you must provide actual education, actual teachers going to the cells of people who are in solitary confinement. But the school really wasn't ready to do that. And so they were like, anybody want to go? And so as an educator, and then during the years that I was there as like a teaching artist, I did a lot of teaching in solitary confinement. And so we talk about that now. Now there's like, people are talking about solitary confinement. At the time, nobody was talking about solitary confinement. And I think it's worth noting that, because it's worth noting how quickly things can change, right? How quickly the narrative can change. Okay, so I have this relationship with Rikers. I'm going there once a week to facilitate a workshop. And I'm working a million other jobs. I'm like doing community organizing, and I'm working as a teaching artist and all this stuff. And I wanted someone to pay me to go to Rikers, and I couldn't find anybody to pay me. So I went to all these organizations, and I was like, hey, like I already have this thing set up, and it was really hard to set up, and like I'll give it to you, but I just want to facilitate this workshop. Can you pay me? And people were like, oh, you know, like the arts organizations were like, that's great, but why there? And the organizations that work there doing like what people now call reentry work, they were like, that's great, but why poetry? Like, why art? So they were like, I mean, like, why not resume writing? Wouldn't that be more useful? So I inadvertently started an organization. I like kind of didn't mean to. I just, I was young, and you know what? One of the benefits of there being no information on the internet is that I had no idea what I was getting myself into. So I founded Voices Unbroken, and Voices Unbroken makes creative writing workshops accessible to vulnerable youth, as was said in my intro. Lovely, thank you. So basically, I'll talk a little about our workshop. So I'll give you some more details there. That's just our mission. So that's what we referenced before. But I want to explain a little bit the juvenile justice system, because even if you're from the United States, this ish doesn't make any sense, okay? So let's talk about juvenile justice system in the United States. So there's two ways to wind up in the juvenile justice system. Wait, everybody like, think back to like roughly 1900, okay, in New York City. Think back, like you've seen a movie, you've seen like, I don't know, Gangs of New York or something, right? Okay. So there was a lot of immigration. There was a lot of immigration, which, let's just be clear, there were no laws at that time. Nobody's families came here legally because there were no laws to abide by. There were no like federal immigration laws till 1924. So whatever crazy ass people are saying that right now, you just ignore them because they are wrong. So when this language, like delinquency. So remember, like there's a lot of immigration. You have a lot of women who are working outside of the home in factories and stuff. And there's no compulsory, I don't believe there's compulsory education yet, like mandatory kids have to be in school. So you have a lot of kids who are like kind of wandering the streets during the day, right? And they might be selling, they might be peddling stuff, they might be selling stuff, they might be stealing, they might be doing whatever. But there is like the Protestant well-to-do folks in our country, right? There was a lot of judgment about these kids. And really, it was an indictment on immigrant mothers. Like, let's be clear, okay? Again, immigrant mothers who didn't come here legally because there were no laws, right? They just came here because that's how you did it back then. So now, and before there was juvenile justice law, they would just incarcerate kids with adults. So it was thought to be a very revolutionary thing that you would separate children from adults, okay? But in the beginning of our juvenile justice system, kids had like indeterminate sentences. So a girl could be arrested at like 12 and they could just hold her until 18. And they would like basically loan her out to rich families as labor because she was being taught how to, like she was being, you know, domesticated, right? They were basically like, oh, she's gonna learn how to like run a home kind of thing, right? She'll learn how to cook and clean, okay? So the history of our juvenile justice system is really insidious. If you care about it, you should read about it because it's really insidious. So there's two ways that someone can wind up in the juvenile justice system even now to this day. One is a delinquent act. So a delinquent act is something that would be a crime if an adult committed it. So like hopping the train. Like that's actually illegal. You really aren't supposed to hop the train. I think it's called like theft of service or something. You're not really supposed to hop the train. So that's actually something that like an adult could get arrested for, a kid can get arrested for. Then there are status offenses. So a status offense is like running away from home. Like if you're an adult, you just like left your house. Like, you know what I mean? Like your wife is mad at you, but you just left your house. But if, you know, so truancy, right? If you're an adult, you don't go to work, you lost your job, right? Or you don't go to school if you're in school, you know, whatever, like nobody's gonna, but but truancy, as a kid not going to school, that's called a status offense. So kids can get arrested for those and put into juvenile detention facilities. Now, New York City will tell you we don't ever do that. All right, let me tell you what we do in New York. We arrest kids and we put them on probation. Why? Because America likes to watch you. Now, what's going to happen with a kid on probation? They're going to violate, right? They're going to violate probation. Because, right? And not always, but like it's likely. So then they'll violate probation and then they wind up in detention. So we just created like a little loop, but it still happens. Now, some states, including New York, have certain offenses, kids automatically go into the adult system. It's called direct file. So like if a kid is charged with like manslaughter, which is a complicated charge. Like, do not assume from that charge that the child killed anybody. That's complicated, right? There's a lot in that. But some states they automatically then go into the adult system. So they kind of like, so they might be held in the juvenile justice system, but they wind up going through the criminal court. There will be a gavel banged at some point, right? And they'll probably be forced to take a plea bargain. Let's be honest, okay? So that's our juvenile justice system. It's tried in the same court as our foster care system. Foster care, I think, so see, with foster care is actually hard to talk about in an international way, because a lot of places don't even really have, people often compare foster care to like orphanages, but in the United States, kids who are in foster care oftentimes have parents. It's not that they don't have parents, and oftentimes it's not that their parents don't want to care for them. The vast majority of kids who are in foster care are there because their parents have been, or guardians have been charged with neglect. And neglect is a really broad, like, thing. So neglect doesn't necessarily mean that, like, you left your kid at home for, like, 2 weeks by themselves, right? Neglect can mean a lot of different things. And by and large, we're talking about, like, poor people and people of color where the system gets involved and they're, like, deeply involved in their lives because America likes to watch you, right? If you're poor, they like to watch you. If you're like rich, I don't know what they do. But okay, so that's our juvenile justice system. So,
like double minutes right now.
do I? Yeah. Okay, I'm down for whatever. All right, so I just used our 2015, 2016 stats, not for nothing, because I already had a slide made about it, because I did some presentation. I was being lazy, and I'm going to be honest about it. All right, so. These are the, like, where the young people that we worked with came from. I left these both kind of in red because these are young people who were in, like, locked facilities, right? So young people in the juvenile justice system, adolescents on Rikers Island, and youth. There's a jail in lower Manhattan, like a little bit south of Canal. There's a Manhattan detention complex, and they have a unit there that's specifically for trans people. So we were doing work there. So these people were on probation or in alternative to detention programs. So they were physically free, but they were being watched. Like they were being, they had to report. These young people were in a residential drug treatment program. So not a jail exactly, but most of them were there because they were mandated there by the court. In some cases because their kids had been removed from them, but for the most part because they had usually it was because they had drug crimes. And that was, if they completed that program, then they wouldn't have to do jail or prison time. So when we work with youth in foster care, it's young people who are in residential facilities as part of the foster care system. So they've been removed from their families and they're living not with another family, they're living like in a group setting. It's called congregate care, but again, that's in the weeds there. And then this little 4% were people who had no relationship to the justice system. No court had sent them. They were just kids. Okay. So we can't take pictures. So that's why people are blurred, and to cover people's tattoos, it was really dicey. That's why this picture is actually not that current, because it's so hard to get any pictures at all. And this is in a residential drug treatment facility, which is why they're using like pens and stuff, because that would be contraband, like in a prison or jail. Okay. So, are any of you visual art? Like, I know everyone's here for design, but are any of you actual visual artists? Folks are, okay. I love visual art. If I was a visual artist, like, this whole thing would be all detail. Like, I'd be drawing things right now. But, so since we can't take pictures, I asked a teaching artist who's also a visual artist. We commissioned her to do a series of illustrations to try to describe what actually happens in a Voices Unbroken workshop. And then this is Voices Unbroken, but you know, there's workshops all over there are other organizations in New York City, and then all over the country, there are organizations that are doing somewhat similar things. So this is a teaching artist. Up there you see scissors. That's because she's not in jail. This teaching artist is preparing. We're not bringing scissors in. I once got a pair of children's scissors cleared to bring into Bayview Correctional Facility, which has since closed. I was very proud of myself. It took me like 5 years. And I was the only one who was allowed to use them. So it was like, but I did it. So this is a teaching artist coming into a facility that we work in. This bridge right here is a bridge that leads to Rikers. It doesn't mean, we asked her to, this visual artist visited a bunch of workshops, so it's sort of a mixture of all of them. These are kind of the waiting areas. Usually teaching art, you know, teaching artists have to surrender phones and stuff like that. They can't bring them inside. They usually have to lock them up somewhere. They get wanded, you know, like at the airport. I don't even know why they do that at the airport. We're not any safer, I promise. But okay, so then in an actual workshop, so we collect, Voices Unbroken collects a lot of documentation. Mm-hmm. So that's like kids filling out a sign-in sheet. I'll show you what these look like a little later, but these are like pre-survey. We ask young people to fill out surveys so we can get some data from them so we know a little more about them. Usually, Voices Unbroken, like usually we have to get escorted everywhere. So this would be like a staff person escorting. We can't walk around places by ourselves. And these would be young people. These would be participants. These are these odd chairs that I've never seen outside of a juvenile facility. They call them like bricks. You can't move them. I guess the idea is you can't throw them, but it's the strangest thing. Like, who would even invent that? Okay. So then this is a teaching artist putting up Common Ground is a tool that we use to kind of establish group agreements. Okay. So, and this is a teaching artist like facilitating activities. So Voices Unbroken focuses on craft. So our focus is less on content, it's more on craft. So I won't say, it's not that we don't care what young people write about, like they shouldn't write about about their crimes or whatever they're there for. They shouldn't write about their cases. But other than that, it's not that we're not guiding young people to write about like the worst thing that ever happened to them or like changes they want to make in their lives. We want them to learn the tools that, I'll talk a little later about kind of like having a toolkit, right? But we want them to have the tools that they need to express themselves. Now, do we know the vast majority of them have experienced trauma? Do we want to talk about it with them? I mean, if it comes up, but we're not going to prompt them to do that because it's not really, these facilities are not spaces that are designed for healing, right? So there might be a point in their lives where they're going to engage in a healing process, and we know that it will be helpful at that point if they can communicate about their emotions, if they can, you know. So we want them to have those tools to be able to communicate and to understand what poetry is, because that's what we do, right? So we want them to know what poetic devices are. We want them to have the confidence of feeling like I understand this. I'm proficient in it. So then these are young people getting certificates. So like, well, let's say we'll do like a 10 or 12 week workshop. This young person's obviously reading a poem up there. This is a staff person. That's the ID they have. Like applauding for them so that they get an opportunity to share their writing, and then they get certificates at the end of a workshop. And a lot of times for young people who are in the settings that we meet them in, they've had really transient experience. A lot of times they've been in many different schools. They may not have graduated. They may have like gotten enough credits to graduate but not actually attended a graduation, you know. So getting a certificate can really mean a lot for folks. And then at the bottom you see the teaching artist leaving, right? Because that's the reality of what anyone does who works in facilities like this is you leave, right? And that's the kind of bitter reality of it. So I wanted to make a note about youth development because our society doesn't talk about youth development. Like it's just one of those things that like it looks, if you do it well, it looks easy. So we just don't talk about it. But there's a narrative in our society that like the kids who are in the systems that we work in need to change. And our narrative as a youth development organization, my narrative as a youth worker, is that people grow. And they may not grow in the direction we want them to. They may not grow in a positive direction, but everybody will grow. Like none of you are who you were at 14. It just is what it is, right? I'm not who I was at 16, right? So it's the acknowledgement that like being human means you will grow. And so the young people that we work with are going to grow. And there's nothing inherently wrong with them. They don't need to change, right? They need to grow because they're teenagers. We also, so you hear a lot in arts education about scaffolding, right? About this idea of like artistic mastery. This idea that you would come in and you would teach a kid, like, let's say with visual art, you would teach them how to draw something, and then you would teach them how to fill it in, and you would teach them perspective, right? Like things would be incremental. And so because we work in really transitional settings, we don't focus on that. And this was sort of like, I kind of developed this technique at Rikers because I realized that sometimes people would have court dates or whatever. So like I might see somebody for like months, but they would miss half of the time, right? Because they would be going to court, or they would be in solitary confinement, or something would be happening. Through no fault of their own, understanding that like solitary confinement, they might have gotten into a fight or whatever, they might have made some choices, but the reality is like they might also really have wanted to be in the workshop, right? So instead what we focus on is building a toolkit. So every session is self-contained. So that like let's say there's 10 sessions. If you came to 5 of them, you would have had 5 experiences, right? That began and ended. And you wouldn't have missed anything, right? You would have had 5 full experiences. If you came to 10, you would have had 10 full experiences, right? And so all of this is in the spirit of kind of developing a toolkit. So I wanted to explain that's sort of how we think of it. So I was told that you might want to know about impact or outcomes. So impact, so these are the forms that we use. We used to use really boring forms. But then, but kids don't like boring forms. I don't know. They looked like census forms. I don't know. Like I made them. They were boring forms. So we asked a teaching artist to, who's also a graphic artist, to develop like forms that look a little bit less like forms. This is where we ask young people, if you know the zip code of the last place you lived, what is it? And it needed an image because kids didn't know what the zip code was. So we had to have an image of an envelope. So we asked young people for basic like demographic information, but then we asked them to answer a series of questions. Then we do a post survey, and we ask these same questions again, and we compare them. So stuff like, I like to read, I read every day, I like poetry, stuff like that. And then we ask also on the final survey, we also ask them questions that are kind of retrospective to reflect on the workshop. So here, like that's a post survey. You have to appreciate when we asked, what could be improved? The kid wrote, nothing really. So thank you. Okay, so these are some of the outcomes that we found. And where there's like a little arrow, it means that like we took their response on the post survey and their response on the pre-survey, and that's like the difference between the two. So some of what we're looking for are knowledge and skills to be increased. I won't read them all to you. You can all read. I can go back to any of these if you want. And then we also look for sort of social emotional. A lot of arts organizations talk about social emotional skills or social emotional learning, social emotional development, right? And so, so we look for, and a lot of these sort of questions that we ask are things we added over time, so that our teaching artists, we would always kind of reflect as an organization, like how do we know when things are working? And so, in this case, like I helped one of my peers in this workshop, and I received help from one of my peers. It was because our teaching artists were noticing that like young people were helping each other, and that seemed to be something that the staff were telling us doesn't happen all the time. People don't always help each other. So what's funny is we consistently kids tell us that they help other kids less than they get helped, which is kind of interesting because that couldn't really be true, right? If you think about it, right? You must all be helping somebody. It should be even. And then, so the young people we work with have all experienced trauma. And one of the things, I hate to generalize, but it's hard for me to think of anyone who hasn't. So like And even if they hadn't experienced trauma before they went into the system, being in the system was really traumatic. So one of the things about trauma is it keeps people kind of stuck in the present moment or in the past. But it makes it really hard to think concretely or positively about what's going to happen in the future. And so one of the things that we ask young people, some of the questions we ask about our future, are looking towards the future. And the fact that they're even able to do that, we understand is it says something about, it says something about where they are. I'm not going to take credit for that, but it says something about where they are. And those are just some narratives that young people have told us. Young people tell us I write poetry so it will help release anger. Young people say that a lot. That's how I'm going to use it. Like, instead of getting into a fight, I'm going to write a poem and whatever. I'm like, go ahead. That's a really constructive way to use art, don't you think? Don't you think? All right. So I was told that you might want to know about trends in the field. I don't really know what my field is. So there's a lot of fields, right? What's the field? So one of the this is a kind of weird graphic. It's hard to find graphics about evidence exactly, but there's a lot of pressure to do a PowerPoint for a design program, because I know you guys you're all like looking at this PowerPoint like you could have done better with that. But so the field, like criminal justice, juvenile justice in particular, is obsessed right now with evidence. This idea it comes from like a medical model. So this idea of so folks are familiar with like clinical trials and stuff, like when they're testing medicines. So you know the idea of like, this is a medicine we have for migraines, and we want to know if this medicine works, and so we're going to give the migraine medicine to 50 people, and then we're going to have 50 people who have the exact same, who look the same on paper, and we're going to see if it works, right? This is you're going to compare what the results are. So that's kind of what clinical trials are. And so very, very basically, it's not really what clinical trials are, but it comes from a medical model that like something is wrong and needs to be fixed. So you go to your doctor and you're like, oh my God, I get headaches all the time. I can't, it's like always on one side of my head. I get, everything gets blurry, and they go, oh, you have migraine. Something's wrong with you. You're sick. You have to be cured, right? You're sick. So they've kind of applied this to like kind of social, like, so for example, a lot of the ones in the juvenile justice system are about decision making. So they want to teach kids how to make good decisions. So they come up with these these evidence-based practices that they refer to as interventions, and it'll be like a 6-week course or a 12-week thing, and at the end of it, you're supposed to be able to make better decisions. Which is fascinating, because like adolescent brain science is like so not having that. But it also, one of the challenges with that is that it's really hard to find evidence for art, right? It's hard to find evidence for like building relationships. It's hard to find evidence for like being, like for having adults that care about you. Like those things they're intangible, and so it's really hard to find evidence for them. And so it means that things like art and good youth development work, which requires relationship building, it means that it's getting harder and harder to fund those things because money is getting tied to to this idea of evidence, right? Which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. Then, so one of the things that's happening in the field too that's complicated is social media. So people want a video these days, right? You watch videos. My husband spends like hours watching like YouTube videos. I don't even know. But so a lot of the way that people get information right now is around images, Instagram, right? Like, things are visual. People are visual. People are becoming increasingly visual learners. They're thinking visually. Well, what's complicated about people who are in the justice system, in particular the justice system, the juvenile justice system, or like young adults in the adult system who might get their cases closed, is that like their identities should never be released, right? Their faces should never be shown, because ideally, like their cases are going to get closed, and we should never even know that they were there, right? Especially because the inclination then is to criminalize them. So like you see a kid in a locked facility, right? there's bars involved. You know what I mean? It implies that they did something wrong, but we know that they might have committed a stat, they might have run away, they might have been truant, do you know what I mean? And everything spiraled and they wound up in the system. So the idea of then criminalizing them and releasing their identity is complicated, but it's what people, I mean, like, I can't tell you how many times people have called me and they're like, you know, we want to do a news story, but we want a videotape. And I'm like, well, will you block everyone's faces, or, you know, will you shoot from the side? Because they can do that, right? And they're like, no, we have this like idea of how we want to do it. We want like full frontal images. And I'm like, of kids in the no, like that's crazy. But it's increasingly something that like people want. So it's become a real ethical challenge, because there's always going to be organizations, there's always going to be people who are like, yeah, come on in. Like, there's always going to be some way to do that. And so it's a question, you know, like how we, I think it winds up, there needs to at some point really be standards where we say like, we don't need, and where people just say, I don't need that. Like, there's other ways to get information. So another trend in the field is that way more people are involved, or are learning about these issues. And part of that is because of, you know, the 2-minute videos you can find online and that kind of thing, right? But way more people are informed about a lot of these issues. And now one of the challenges is people have been working in these systems a long time, and there's not a lot of historical record. So like, I started working on Rikers in the 90s, and I know there were people doing work there in the 60s and 70s, right? But I never saw like images, like, you know, writing from I just heard rumors that this was happening, but I never really saw any documentation of it, right? And so I feel like that's one of the realities of the systems that I have spent my career working in, is that what happens in them doesn't get documented well. And so there's a lot of people who are new to the field. And this is also for like in like the reform community, right? So there's always people who are new to like justice reform, right? There's people who've been working on justice reform for like, since there's been a justice system, right? Like there's been people working on justice reform, right? And so I think that it's something that people are blaming it on the millennial generation, but I don't think we can blame like people of a certain age. I don't think that's the problem. I think like as a society, we're not really good at remembering that like things happen before the present day. And what we run the risk of doing, because a lot of things haven't really been documented well, and there's a lot of, like, I'm seeing a lot of the people who were like my mentors and stuff are getting older. People are getting Alzheimer's. People are, you know, and so they're retiring. They're, you know, like, and leaving the field. And so what we run the risk of doing is like we recreate the wheel, and then there's a lot of really unintended consequences that can happen from that, right? In particular, when we think about reform stuff, right? Like people know why we've been fighting for one thing and not for another thing, right? Like, and because the rationale for different things may not be documented well, we run the risk of like making a lot of mistakes. This is my attempt at my imagery for intersectionality. But I think there does seem to be more of an understanding that the justice system in particular intersects with all these other things, with art, that there's financial implications. It intersects with the health or mental health system, with the education system. I could have added 50 more, right? Like, so I think there's more and more of an understanding that like the justice system is a part in the United States, right? Is a really insidious part of our lives, and it's everywhere, right? You just can't always see it. So I thought we should close with a poem that a 13-year-old wrote. So you gotta give him some credit here. Would anyone like to read art? Would anyone like to read Joshua's poem? The only reason I'm giving you his first name is because it's a really common name. Yeah.
Voice is unbroken. My voice is unbroken like the hollow sound of living. It's shielded with boastful steel. It makes the wise wiser, for it's an incredible sound of crisp thunder roaring from the mouth. It's unbroken like the gates of heaven. It's great in sound and you can't see it, but it's unbroken, and none shall shudder it. For it is great and strong and divine like my ancestors, whom shall shudder what, but not my voice, because it's unbroken, and shall stay unbroken, not shuttered, but unbroken.
Go ahead, Joshua. We should applaud for Joshua. He can't hear us, but we should applaud for him. He was a kid who was like really obviously like into like the classics, and like he's a kid, if you were teaching Shakespeare, like you want him in your class kind of thing. You know what I mean? He was really into that. And that's my information. So that is my presentation. I am happy to take questions and answers, and I know you have classmates who are going to lead you in an activity, right?
Yeah. So let's have questions first, and then we get one second.
So how,
Well, yep.
so how did you get the young kids even care about writing poetry at first day? Is it mandatory for them, or do you have freedom to choose not being there?
Well, we always ask for young people, not necessarily to make it mandatory, but we don't ask for young people to opt in. So we don't want them to have to say, yes, I want to be there. Because a lot of times it's hard for young people to say yes. Do you know what I mean? And we believe that everybody wants to express themselves. They just don't always know that they want to do that. So we just try to make it really fun. And we also have different, like a lot of this is based on the way that I think about arts education, right? So I believe that people can participate in a lot of different ways, right? And so what we really want young people to do is participate with their presence. We want them to be there and to really be there. And if they write, they write. If they listen to their peers while their peers are reading their writing, that's a way of participating. If they listen respectfully, if they make a comment, if they applaud when their peers are, if they participate in a discussion. So those are all different ways that they might participate. And so we honor the fact that there's a lot of different ways to be present in the room. And so, like, do all young people write? No. But sometimes we'll have young people who don't write at all, and then tell us they got a lot out of it. That's fine. Like, we're not going to judge their experience, And a lot of times what will also happen is that we'll work with young people over a period of time, and so they might be in the first workshop cycle for like 10 sessions. They don't write at all. Second workshop cycle, they write a little bit, but they won't share it. We meet them like a year later, they're still in the system, and then they're willing to write and they're willing to share. So part of it's also about their development. Like, that's not about us, right? That's about them also getting older and more confident. Yeah, it's a good question though. Yeah.
What was the common goal? Common ground.
Oh, so common ground. So common ground is just the word, the way, they're group agreements. And so the system, like the systems that we work in have a lot of rules. Like crazy rules. Like you can't have pencils with erasers. It's crazy stuff, okay? So there's a lot of rules. And so we don't want to rely, we want to establish like agreements for how we're going to treat each other. So that might be a little bit different, right? Because we know that part of what we do is go into the spaces that young people are living in. So whether they're jails or juvenile detention facilities or group homes, they're places where they might have their own ways of engaging with each other, which may not be constructive in the moment. And so we want to offer an opportunity, right, for us to have agreements for how we're going to treat each other. So it's a lot of stuff, like one mic, like people, kids will say they don't want anyone to talk over them. So only one person talks at a time. Sometimes people will ask for confidentiality, and that offers us a way to explain that, like, we can only guarantee that to a certain extent, because if a young person writes something that we're concerned about, we would obviously have to we'd have to tell one of the adults there, and because the staff who work in the facilities that we work in, they're mandated reporters, and like corrections officers, they can be called to testify in court and stuff. So it is important to remind young people to be somewhat careful, right? Not talk about their cases and not think that literally everything they say can be kept in the room in this situation. And then kids will ask for like weird stuff. Kids will be like, "Don't throw anything." Like, okay, don't throw anything. And then, but that's something that we'll then revisit at the beginning of every workshop, so that it's like a way of kind of reminding, kind of a ritual that gets created for like reminding us all that we're in the same space that they live in, but we're going to create a little bit different space in this moment as much as we can.
So how long does it take to like young kids adopt this kind of common ground?
Well, so we'll establish it the first day, and they might be a little skeptical, you know, like, okay, whatever. But then we'll just keep revisiting it. And it's right about the time when someone goes like, oh, man, it's like we always do that, and you're like, it's working. There's often like a few kids who really need it, because it's also acknowledging that like kids socialize differently with each other, right? And so sometimes you get kids who really don't know what to do in a group with other kids. They don't know what the norms are. They don't know what's expected of them, and they need it. They really do need someone to say like, this is how we're going to treat each other, and it comforts them. So you can tell that there's sometimes kids who really like they need it in a different way. Okay, so there's a hand over here, and then I'll come over here. Yeah.
I just want to know about more about the curriculum.
Yeah.
And also like what resources besides like the workshop that are available
Mm-hmm.
to them in the facility. Like do they have access to libraries?
They do have access to libraries. The quality of a library really depends on where they are. The New York Public Library actually goes to Rikers. They actually have librarians that go to Rikers. They can't have hardcover books. It's a little bit limiting. But there are some really, really good like young adult librarians that work in juvenile facilities, at least. I'd say the like non-secured facilities in the juvenile justice system that look more like group homes. They're smaller. They're not as confined. And kids in the foster care system, they probably actually get the least amount of books and stuff because the facilities are like, they look like homes. Like they don't really look like homes, but they're like in houses that have been sort of retrofitted to be like detention facilities. And there'll be like, you know, maybe 12 kids or something, so that they probably get the least amount of books and stuff. But then they're through their school they can usually get books. So there are libraries. I don't know what other services you're thinking of. There's lots of different things that they like technically get access to, like mental health services. They get access to. The quality varies, but. They get anyone under the age of 21 in New York State is mandated to be offered educational services. So they do get offered. So they do get school. The quality varies definitely. Like from the time that I was a full-time educator until now, the quality of education has definitely improved. Not because I'm no longer an educator. That sounds kind of bad, but the educational standards have improved. So around the curriculum that we use, so like we developed a curriculum, but it wasn't really, it was more like it's more a guide for teaching artists. But we hire professional teaching artists who that's what they do. They're professional teaching artists, and then they design their own. They determine what they're going to do. We ask them to follow kind of a certain format. So we ask them to introduce young people to poetic devices. We ask them to bring in poems by published poets. We don't specify where they're published or which published poets, but we want them to bring in poems by published poets. And we do give some direction around what those poems should be. So like they shouldn't be too long. Like oddly enough, anyone like slam? I hate slam stuff. Anyone like slam? Worst poem, like you don't want to teach a slam poem for anything in the world. They're all 3-minute poems. They rely a lot on sarcasm. And so they don't work off the page. You can't really, if you ever try to read a slam poem, especially with kids, like a page in, you're like, why did I do this to myself? So usually like a certain length, right? Like, and we asked, and what I learned when I was a teacher at Rikers was, I geared everything towards a 4th grade reading level, because even though my students at Rikers were 16 and up, right? The vast majority of them had really low literacy levels. And so it was better to assume that people had a low literacy level than it was to assume they had a higher, so it's better to read something and be like, that was easy, than to read something and be like, I have no idea what I just read, or not be able to read it at all. So we do give direction like that. We give direction, so we give direction on kind of the structure. This is a structure we want you to use for a workshop, but then they really get to our teaching artists really get to kind of freestyle and figure out, especially for the group, if it's like an all boys group, they might want to, read, this is very stereotypical, but it's true. They might want to read about basketball, or they might want certain sports references or poems that are written by men they might relate to in a different way. Girls, oddly enough, boys on Rikers write more love poems than any of you do, I promise you. Because there's they know they want to keep their girlfriends, they have to write letters. Yeah, so if you want, I can talk more about the curriculum with you if you want more later. You had a question?
Are the poems published anywhere, and has anyone ever approached you about like a publishing partnership to display these, or?
We've done our own we've published done our own publications. One of the complications we have with that is that the vast majority of kids we work with are under the age of 18, and so they can't give consent. They're legally their guardian would have to give consent, and because there's system involved, it's like their parent or guardian would have to give consent. Then the facility that they're in, like if it's run by a private agency or if they're in the foster care system, they'd have to give consent. Then the city would have to give consent because those are all contracted through the city. So so it's really complicated. Like if it was one kid, it's one thing, but to do that for 50 kids or something. So we do publications, but we can't sell them. We'll self-publish books, and then we could trade them for a donation, but we have to be really clear that we can't. We get implied consent from kids is okay. Or kids will say it's okay, but we can't. That doesn't count as legal permission. So.
Actually turning out a profit.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit to how funding and payment and stuff works in this, or if you've given off donations or how that works?
I'm always happy to talk about funding. So Voices Unbroken has what everyone says you want, but it's complicated to maintain. The very diversified funding, so we get funding from private foundations, from kind of a variety. Some foundations care about our work with girls, some foundations care that we work in the Bronx, some foundations care about youth development. So I would say if any of you wind up in this field or are working at nonprofits, one of the reasons that that the organization is alive at all, right, is because I'm a writer. And I didn't start out as a grant writer. I've gone to a workshop or two. I've never taken a grant writing class. But the ability to pivot and talk about the work from many different vantage points has really been instrumental in the ability to get funding. Then we get some public money. Most of the public money that we get is National Endowment for the Arts, New York State Council on the Arts, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, so it's arts related money. Those are that's the best money because they just get it. They get art. Everybody else, you got to be art. This is what art does. This art is in the service of. Artists, you just art. You're just it's art. This is art. We do art. You get art. You like art. They're human, and we do art. We got a little bit of discretionary city council money, through city council members. We do some of our workshops are fee for service, because increasingly there are private agencies that get contracted with the government to run, some of the juvenile justice facilities and some of the other facilities. And foster care, et cetera, and so we'll contract with them where they pay us, or at least pay a portion of what it costs, and then individual donations and the usual hustle. Yeah.
It kind of seems like you got into the system by chance, you saw
very
the
much so.
artist, and so do you have any ideas or ways that students like us could get involved? What are some entry points you see being existent for just people outside the system that are interested?
And what are you thinking of in particular? What part of the system are you thinking, or
so say
what?
the justice system, whether it's juvenile or the adult detention system. If someone like a designer wants to get involved in trying to maybe expose these individuals to design thinking, what would you say some ways for an outsider are to get involved? Because there's an entry barrier to getting into the system if you're not in the system. So
I would say to look for the organizations that are already doing the work that you want to do. In New York right now, it used to be that there were very few organizations that were working in these systems, and now there are a lot more. I feel like there's the Center for Urban Pedagogy. Does a lot of work either in the system or with people who are related to the system. I know they just did a big project. They do a lot of, so their work is design. And I know they just did a work with like family members whose kids were in the system, like designing materials that would be helpful, like to actually explain what the system is and what's done. So they might be like an entry point. But I would just start looking around to see, and sometimes following the money can help. Like, so trying to see like who's getting money to, you know, you can check in New York it's Department of Cultural Affairs from the city, New York State Council on the Arts, and then there's a National Endowment for the Arts. You could see like who's getting money in the different program areas that they have to do work in the justice system, and just try to track down organizations and, you know, find people that are doing stuff that's like-minded. For people who want to do like teaching artist work, I guess the best training program I know of is through Community Word Project, and they do so they do like a training. I want to say it's like a year. It might be like a few months shy of a year, but it's a program for visual artists or for poets or writers. And I think most of the training they do is within the school system, but it is a way of kind of training to be a teaching artist, and then those are the same like tools or you know that you would need. I mean, because that's the thing. Like, I kind of cut my teeth like working in the system. I wouldn't really advise that. Like, I wouldn't hire me. Like, I wouldn't hire me as a 22-year-old. You know, it's also that as a teenager, I grew up during a moment in New York City when there was a lot of funding for youth development. And there was funding, this was like during the crack epidemic and the AIDS epidemic, and there was a movement not only in New York but kind of around the country around peer education. This was kind of because like adults didn't want to talk about sex or violence. It's sort of the reality of it, right? So they would like train teenagers to go and like talk to other kids about sex or violence. So I got a lot of facilitation training as a teenager, again, kind of by chance, right? And a lot of that is what I used as a teaching artist, because and as a classroom teacher, because you know it's hard to train. There are like even most teachers who start out like young teachers, they don't even get enough training. Like there's just we don't value education enough to train people well. You have another question?
I know they're not allowed to have certain materials, but since teaching them poetry, have any of them expressed interest in other forms of self-expression, like is self-expression begetting self-expression kind of a thing?
I think self-expression always I mean, I feel like it's a phenomenon of like people fall in love with their own voices when they get there, right? Like once they really hear their own voice, you know, whether it's like, you know, whether they find like their style of writing and it resonates with them, or like they start to draw and they really get, you know, like this is my style, right? Like people will really fall in love with their own voices. And so we definitely, you know, the more common things are where young people start to write rhymes, or they want to like, just because there is a kind of natural connection there, or write songs or things like that. But we definitely, young people definitely, we hear that, or people will say, oh, like I send my writing home, you know, like I send it to my grandmother or whatever, you know, so they start to share it too. Good question.
So when you talk about your goal is not to healing the children, it's give them tools to communicate later. I think this really explains the goal and it explains it well. So did you get this kind of goal in the beginning, or gradually you kind of clarify what?
That's such a good question. You know what, it was gradually, and part of it was because people would lay a goal on top of the work, right? So I would talk about the work and people would go, oh, because you're healing them or you're transforming them. And I had like a visceral like, no, like that's not what we do. That's like, first of all, like a person can't heal another person. I mean, like unless you're like a doctor and someone has a gashing wound, like yes, then you can heal them. But like you can't heal somebody else's like internal experience. Like you can't do that. Like that's like work somebody has to do themselves, right? You could support somebody, but you know. So it was over time. I think it's also like the more that I learned about trauma, the more that I learned about like brain science and neuroplasticity and like what it really takes to kind of this like long work that people have to do. So it's not, it's also the work of growing up, right? Because like you work with kids and it's like, they're gonna grow. Their brains are gonna grow, their brains are gonna form. I mean, like we don't want them in these systems because their brains will get formed by these systems, right? So we want them free and we want them, right? We want them to have positive experiences so their brains can develop from that, right? But one way or the other, they're going to grow. So that definitely developed over time. I mean, I didn't even used to call the organization a youth development organization. I used to say we were an arts organization. But then we started hiring, like once I got in the position where I was hiring artists, some of the best artists, oh my God, were the worst youth workers. And so then I kept going, okay, wait, so what the best people, what do they have in common, right? The people who are the best in the room. And I realized it was all people who had a youth development background. So they were coming in and they were coming in and they understood, like it's our job when, like, I feel like as an adult, if I'm working with a young person, it's my job to engage them. It is not their job to engage with me. And now this is one of the reasons why, like, let me tell you, male slam poets, I'm generalizing here. I can think of maybe one or two exceptions. But I'm saying the vast majority of slam poets in general make the worst teaching artists. And I'll tell you why. Because their experience in the art is being applauded. They want to win, and they want to be applauded. And you don't win with young people, and they don't applaud you. I mean, it's not performative. Do you know what I mean? It feels like you're performing, but it's not performative. So I think it's like knowing that. So I believe that as an adult working with a young person, it is my responsibility to not want anything from them. Or want anything for them. Like, I want them to express themselves, but I don't, like, it's not my job to like to determine what their goals are, right? Or like what they should be working towards, that's for them to determine for themselves, right? And I shouldn't want anything from them, right? Like, I shouldn't want to feel good. I shouldn't want to be validated by the experience of working with them. I shouldn't need them to tell me that it's working. You know what I mean? Like that they're thinking differently or they're expressing themselves more. I shouldn't need that because it's not their job to do that for me, right? And so all of that comes from a youth development background. And it took me years to realize that that's the framework that I was using. It took me years and a lot of terminating people. Yeah. Okay. I like it. No, that should always happen. Yes.
You had a question. Go ahead. I'm wondering, has the workshops impacted groups like under 12 or over 24?
It has. So I personally have done a lot of work with adults, and on behalf of the organization and not on behalf of the organization. There came a time around, once the organization had been around for maybe 5 to 7 years, we had to kind of narrow, because our mission's really broad, and our mission didn't used to have ages in it. It used to just say underheard members of the community, and so we were doing a lot of work with adults and whatever. And it just became necessary to kind of to say, what do we do best, and where do people need it the most, and to kind of narrow. And originally it was I think we had said 14 to 21, but then we were realizing sadly there's a lot of kids who were 12, 13 that we wanted meeting in the system. And then, 21 felt really limiting because we definitely were working with young people who were in their early 20s. There's also a lot of brain science that says that adolescence really doesn't end until 24, 25. So, yeah. So it has, but the funding is mostly for 12 to 24 is the reality. You had a hand?
Yeah.
I'm sure it was a brilliant question, though. Okay. Yep.
No, go ahead.
Do you use any electronic products in your house?
It's actually an interesting. I was thinking about it a lot before coming here because I was thinking you guys work in design and you're you probably use technology a lot and stuff. It's actually been a challenge for us because we can't bring most of the settings we work in, we can't bring technology in. Sometimes we work in places where we can, and then it's actually a different challenge because we're we don't have rules about, even internally, we don't have tablets or anything we can give to a teaching artist to bring in or things like that. The most of the places that we work in, you can't bring anything in. If you can, they can't connect to the internet and stuff like that. So it would mean we'd have to have stuff that teaching artists could borrow, or so like things would have to be like set up in a way that people couldn't use their own personal stuff. So like one, it's expensive to like do that, to invest in that kind of like hardware, but also it's something that like we got conditioned as an organization to assume that we couldn't because in so many places we can't. But I think that's starting to change. Like right now at Rikers, it's crazy, but like they got tablets. Some of the kids get tablets. It's like, and they had to get the tablets, like I think it was Department of Defense or something, like had to like program them in some complicated way. So it's like everything that's possible is possible, but it's complicated. So it's like a no, but we should figure it out. Oh, you had a hand.
Me, yes.
Yes.
Okay. I just want to let everyone else go. But I had a question about, you started to refer to this when you were talking about kind of what makes a good teaching artist.
Mm-hmm.
But what, as a title, like what is that job? How do people become teaching artists and how do they gravitate towards working with incarcerated youth or youth?
It's a good question. I feel like when I first entered the field, that no one said teaching artist. Everybody used to say like poet in residence or artist in residence, which was kind of weird for me because I have always worked in like correctional settings, and I was like, well, I don't reside here, like let's be clear, right? Like that seemed like a weird thing. But so that's what they used to like. That's how I used to always hear it referred. And the idea of like poet in residence or artist in residence, it came really out of like a school-based model, right? So you'd be like affiliated with a school. I think the term teaching artist, over the years, that seems to be what it's like shifted to, and I think that's in part because, the residence language didn't really make any sense, right? But I think also the idea that it's something different than being like a visual artist who chooses to work in a school. It's choosing to be like, in addition to being an artist, being an educator. So, I mean, New York has a ton of teaching artists. I think probably us in like the Bay Area, maybe LA, like Chicago has a lot too. But like we probably have like the most kind of per capita of teaching artists. And there's organizations like if that's work that people are interested in doing, I mean, there's organizations all over the city that hire teaching artists. I think, and really different. So Voices Unbroken only hires professional teaching artists, right? So we're looking for people who've been teaching artists for like 3 to 5 years at least, and we look for people who've worked in non-school settings. So the vast majority of teaching artists work in school settings, right? You can imagine that's where a lot of the work is. And so like the choice to be a teaching artist oftentimes comes out of someone's choice to be a practicing artist. So like it would be really hard to be a practicing artist and be a full-time educator. Let me tell you, it will be hard to be anything and be a full-time educator. Like hardest job in the world. No one ever talks about that. It's really hard to be a classroom teacher. But like it would be hard to like work those like grueling hours and then also be a practicing artist. So I think oftentimes the desire to be a teaching artist comes out of the desire to be a practicing artist. But there are organizations that will hire entry-level teaching artists, and then there are places like Community Word Project that do training, that have training programs. But I mean, like, you can go on like Idealist and places like that if people are looking to do that kind of work. Yeah.
You just mentioned like picking non-school setting artists. Why is that?
Personally, I've always gravitated towards non-school settings because I feel like other people, I feel like there are some teaching artists that like to work in non-school settings and in school settings, but I think there are some teaching artists who need the structure of a school setting. It's where they feel most comfortable. So like if you go into a school, there's always going to be a chalkboard or something like that. There's going to be chairs. You're going to know where people are going to sit. It's going to be clear where you stand as the educator, right? I prefer non-school settings, but non-school settings usually don't have any of that. So you don't know where people are going to, you're kind of like figuring out as you go along, right? Like there's not always going to be something that you can write on. There's not always going to be, like, those norms aren't going to be there. And personally, I like that, but some people really don't. And so it seems to me that, like, since I'm okay with that, like, I should work in non-school settings, because there's a lot of teaching artists that really they really thrive in school-based settings. And I feel like for people who do want to do teaching artist work, I feel like you got to kind of experiment, right? Like, and figure out, you know, most teaching artists start out in school-based settings. And then I think it's learning if that's like, if you need that. Do you need that kind of structure? Those kind of like norms, you know, in order to really thrive.
But are those mostly spatial or are they instructional as well?
The teaching artists?
Yeah. I mean, like being in a school setting versus a non-school setting.
Well, that also really varies, right? So a lot of times when people are in school settings, they'll be working along with a classroom educator. So like, let's say it's there's actually a trend now where they'll put like teaching artists in like science or math classrooms, where they're like supporting that curriculum. So let's say it's like a biology class, and then they'll be doing writing, and it'll be about, you know, the body or about nature or whatever, right? Like, so that there's some sort of a parallel. So in school-based settings, oftentimes there is some like there's some agreement where the teacher's like, oh, this is what we're working on, right? And then the artists can develop their curriculum accordingly. In non-school settings, it really varies on what the setting is, and you know, if there are any other requirements. You know, like I've done a lot of work in like reentry programs where they want you to be where they want people to be writing about stuff that has to do with their future goals or about employment or whatever like that. You know what I mean? So a lot of it's kind of working with a partner, you know. Does that answer your questions? Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, cool. Great, well, thank you. I really appreciate it. Should I unmic myself?